I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in some place unusual.
A 5-year-old girl went under the water twice while cameras kept rolling, and almost nobody watching the finished film ever knew it happened. That single terrifying moment on a quiet Austrian lake is only one piece of a much larger story that 20th Century Fox worked.
In future, you'll kindly remember there are certain rooms in this house which are not to be disturbed.
Yes, Captain, sir.
Why do you stare at me that way?
You don't look at all like a sea captain, sir.
Fred, you don't look very much like a governess.
Hard to keep buried. The Sound of Music is remembered today as the gentlest, warmest musical ever put on screen, a film families still watch together every holiday season. But behind that wholesome image sits a production plagued by near drownings, drunken performances, a director who fled the project in secret, and a set noise so absurd it turned one of cinema's most romantic scenes into a comedy sketch. This is the story the studio never wanted told. Start with the man who was never supposed to leave. Long before Robert Wise took the director's chair, the job belonged to William Wyler, a filmmaker with a reputation as one of Hollywood's most respected craftsmen. Wyler was so committed to the project that he stepped down from his seat on the board at 20th Century Fox to avoid any conflict of interest. On paper, everything pointed toward a smooth production. In reality, Wyler had doubts from the very beginning. He flew to New York to see the Broadway version starring Mary Martin and came away unconvinced, feeling the songs didn't sit naturally inside the story. He was also privately losing his hearing, a condition that made directing a music-driven production increasingly difficult. Rather than admit any of this publicly, Wyler quietly negotiated his way out when producers dangled a very different project in front of him, an adaptation of John Fowles' psychological thriller The Collector. He asked the studio to release him from his contract, and the official explanation given to the press was simple: scheduling conflicts. It wasn't the truth, but it was the story that stuck, and it cleared the way for Robert Wise to step in during late 1963 and inherit a production already standing on shaky ground. Then came the weather. Salzburg looks like a postcard in the finished film, all rolling hills and fairy tale castles, but 1964 turned into one of the wettest years the region had seen in decades. Wise had budgeted 6 weeks for location shooting. It stretched to 11. Over 250 cast and crew members sat idle in soaked clothing while hotel bills, equipment repairs, and mounting wages quietly ate through a budget that had started at roughly $8.2 million, an enormous sum for a mid-1960s musical. The studio was still reeling from the financial catastrophe of Cleopatra, which had gone millions over budget and nearly sunk the company. Watching a cheerful family musical spiral into its own money pit understandably rattled executives, and one studio insider reportedly admitted in private that the picture might finish the studio off entirely. The danger wasn't only financial. During the now famous scene in which the Von Trapp children capsize a small boat on a lake, 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played the youngest daughter Gretel, could not actually swim. The plan called for Julie Andrews to fall toward her the moment the boat tipped and pull her to safety immediately. Instead, when the boat flipped, Andrews fell backward, away from the child. Carruth slipped beneath the surface not once but twice before another cast member dove in to rescue her. She came up vomiting lake water and, according to later interviews, carried a fear of swimming for years afterward. Julie Andrews herself called it one of the most frightening moments of the entire shoot, a story that rarely makes it into the highlight reels built around the film's charm. Physical danger showed up again in the opening sequence, the one now considered one of the most iconic images in movie history. Andrews spinning through an alpine meadow, arms outstretched, as the camera glides overhead. Achieving that soaring aerial shot required a helicopter to fly just 20 feet above her. Each pass sent a blast of rotor wash slamming into her body, knocking her flat into the grass. By her own account, she was blown over somewhere between 6 and 7 times, forced to stand, brush the dirt off, and reset her smile for another take. She later joked that she nearly ended up launched clear into the next country. What audiences experience as effortless joy was, in practice, closer to being repeatedly tackled by a machine. Now to the scene the studio guarded most closely, the gazebo sequence between Maria and Captain Von Trapp. It remains one of the most tender romantic moments ever filmed. Soft light, quiet strings, a long-awaited confession of love. Getting there was nothing close to romantic. The moonlight effect required massive carbon arc lights, industrial equipment that generated an enormous amount of heat and, unfortunately, an equally enormous amount of noise. Every time Christopher Plummer leaned in toward Julie Andrews for the kiss, the lights emitted a loud, unmistakably flatulent sound. According to Andrews, They attempted the shot roughly 20 times, and every single attempt ended the same way, both actors dissolving into laughter the instant their faces got close. Even lines as serious as a declaration of love collapsed into giggling fits that spread through the entire crew. Robert Wise eventually abandoned the original lighting setup altogether and repositioned the actors as silhouettes against the glowing gazebo windows, hiding their faces just enough to disguise the laughter. The soft, dreamlike look audiences associate with the scene wasn't an artistic choice from the start. It was damage control that happened to look beautiful. Fox instructed cast and crew not to discuss what had actually happened, and the truth stayed hidden for decades until Andrews finally described it, laughing, during a television interview years later. Christopher Plummer's own experience on set adds a darker layer to the story. He never hid his dislike for the project, referring to it privately and in later interviews as the sound of mucus, and he described feeling completely disconnected from its sentimental tone. In his 2008 memoir, In Spite of Myself, Plummer admitted to drinking heavily throughout filming, including on the day they shot one of the movie's most emotional beats, the moment the captain sings Edelweiss with visible tears in his eyes at the music festival. He wrote candidly that he had been drinking that day and looked back on himself as an arrogant young actor who felt little genuine connection to the material he was performing. And yet the scene still lands as one of the most moving in the film, an unsettling reminder that a performance audiences read as deeply sincere was, behind the camera, something closer to controlled chaos. Plummer's frustration went even deeper than the script or the schedule. Although he sang some material himself, the more demanding vocal passages, particularly in Edelweiss, were performed by professional singer Bill Lee, who had also provided vocals for Disney films including Sleeping Beauty and Mary Poppins. Producers didn't believe Plummer's voice could carry those sequences and made the substitution without much room for negotiation. Plummer was reportedly furious, feeling it undercut a performance he had already fought hard to shape. Ironically, the blend was so seamless that most audiences to this day still believe they're hearing Plummer sing every note. Compensation created its own quiet resentment. Both Andrews and Plummer signed flat-fee contracts with no royalties and no share of box office profits. Andrews received a fee of $225,000 for a role she took only after Warner Brothers passed her over for My Fair Lady in favor of Audrey Hepburn, a decision Andrews responded to with quiet grace when she thanked the studio head who rejected her while accepting her Academy Award for Mary Poppins that same award season. When The Sound of Music went on to gross over $286 million worldwide and dethrone Gone with the Wind as the highest-earning film in history, neither of its two lead performers saw a cent beyond what they had already been paid. The story behind the story goes back even further, to a decision Maria von Trapp made years before Hollywood ever entered the picture. In the early 1950s, with no agent and no legal team protecting her interests, she sold the rights to her memoir, The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, to a German production company for a one-time payment of roughly $9,000, a modest sum even by the standards of the era. That deal spawned two low-budget German films that became massive commercial successes across Europe and South America, yet when American studios eventually screened them, executives dismissed the productions as amateurish and far too sentimental for American audiences. It took a Tony-winning director named Vincent J. Donahue to see past the low production values and recognize something worth building on, and it was Donahue who first suggested turning the story into a Broadway musical built specifically for Mary Martin. When producers approached Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein about contributing just one or two songs to accompany traditional Austrian folk music, the pair refused outright, insisting they would either write the entire score themselves or have nothing to do with the project at all. That ultimatum reshaped the entire show, giving the world songs like My Favorite Things, Do-Re-Mi, and Climb Every Mountain, music that would later become inseparable from the film itself. Casting the Von Trapp children proved to be its own quietly dramatic ordeal. A young Mia Farrow auditioned 3 separate times for the role of the eldest daughter Liesl, but casting notes reportedly described her as sweet without enough spark, and she was passed over in favor of Charmian Carr, an actress who was actually 21 years old playing a 16-year-old character. Among the boys who tried out for the role of Friedrich was a young Kurt Russell, years before he became known for action films, though the part ultimately went to Nicholas Hammond, who later made his own mark on pop culture as the first live-action Spider-Man on television. The search for the rest of the children stretched on for weeks, with casting directors traveling extensively to find faces, voices, and personalities that felt believable as siblings, a search so thorough that the young actors who were eventually chosen went on to form genuine, lasting friendships that continued for the rest of their lives, long after the cameras stopped rolling. When the film finally reached theaters in 1965, few people, including the executives who financed it, anticipated what was about to happen. Within 18 months, The Sound of Music had done something almost no one thought possible. It overtook Gone with the Wind, a film that had reigned as the highest-grossing movie in history since 1939. It sold an estimated 283 million tickets worldwide, a figure equivalent to roughly 1 out of every 12 people alive on the planet at that time, achieved without trailers circulating online, without social media, and without any of the marketing tools modern films rely on, driven almost entirely by word of mouth and repeat viewings. None of this was public knowledge when the film swept the Academy Awards, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Sound, Best Film Editing, and Best Score. Audiences saw only the polish, the soaring vocals, the tearful reunions, the gentle triumph of love over fear. What they never saw was a director quietly slipping away from a project he no longer believed in, a child pulled from the water twice before anyone could reach her, a leading man drunk during one of his most celebrated scenes, and 2 of the film's biggest stars laughing helplessly through takes ruined by a sound no lighting crew could silence. Decades later, when the people who lived through it finally began speaking honestly in memoirs and interviews, the picture that emerged wasn't one of failure. It was something more human, a story about how genuine artistry can be built in the middle of exhaustion, fear, and improvisation, and how a film remembered for its innocence was, in truth, held together by people quietly fighting to get through each and every day of filming it.